Welcome back to the channel. So a few weeks has passed since the new Walking with Dinosaurs show was released, and having watched the entire series now, I think it's time I explained my thoughts about the program, and boy do I have some thoughts. If you haven't watched the whole show yet, I won't be spoiling that much in this review, since this is more of a general look at the whole series. So my TLDR of the program is that rather simply, Walking with Dinosaurs 2025 is a mediocre, average, run-of-the-mill paleontology documentary. It's almost crushingly mediocre. It doesn't do that much outrightly bad, but at the same time it really doesn't do that much to make it stand out. Everything it does has been done much better by other and in some cases older documentaries. And if the program had been called anything else, that would have been fine. The problem is, however, that as part of what I assume is a cynical marketing exercise, the BBC called this show Walking with Dinosaurs in order to cash in on all that nostalgia that we had for the original program, and as a result we all had certain expectations from a program using that title. Walking with Dinosaurs 2025 is not another season of Walking with Dinosaurs. So I was going to script this, but you see, the thing is, it's really difficult to write a review for something that's very average. You see, if the show is awful like Dinosaur with Stephen Fry, or really good like Prehistoric Planet, it's a lot easier to create a flowing review. But something that's really very average is just no fun to write about. Because what do you really say about a program that is just okay, boilerplate, does nothing awful, does nothing great? So I think the only way I can review this is to basically not script it and just talk. So apologies if this gets a bit rambly. Let's start going through some things in detail, and let's start with probably the most important aspect, which is the CGI. Now, for any paleo documentary, CGI is really important. Walking with Dinosaurs 2025 is inconsistent if I was to use a single word to describe it. There are some good shots where the detail and the lighting works really well. For example, there's some shots of the Spinosaurus that I think are really good. There are some close-up shots of the Gastonia which I think are really good, but then there's a lot of shots which aren't very good, again due to the lighting being pretty poor. So the CGI sort of swings wildly between good and bad, and that just becomes very noticeable. Another issue is that the environmental interactions are done with CGI, or at least most of them seem to be done with CGI, and they're not done through physical interaction with an animatronic or a human. So the animals just end up not really blending into the environment all that often. I think one of the worst examples of this is a shot from episode 6 where the Lucetitan is standing on a beach, and the lighting just makes it look like it's been plonked there without any sort of care or attention at all. There's also some very janky looking animations where the animals don't really move in a very smooth way, or animations where the frame rate, the actual speed of the animation switches. This is really noticeable in the episode with Utahraptor, where the sort of far away shots are at 1 frame rate, but when the camera pans in to look at the animal at close up, the frame rate changes and you can tell, and it just ends up making the animal look laggy. It just draws you out of the program. The inconsistent CGI is a bit disappointing. However, it is superior to anything that Dinosaur with Stephen Fry dreamt up, and there are some really, really beautiful shots that can't be ignored. So overall, I'm going to say that in terms of CGI, it's inconsistent, but it's fine for a TV program. You know, I wasn't expecting Prehistoric Planet levels of CG. This is not Apple. The BBC does not have a lot of money to throw at a single program. So overall, it's all right. Moving on from the CGI of the dinosaurs, let's discuss the actual design of the dinosaurs. Again, most are depicted perfectly fine. New changes to paleontology have been represented, especially in the Spinosaurus, which, if I was to pick a favorite animal from the show, would probably take the win. The new Spinosaurus looks really good and up to date with modern scientific understandings of Spinosaurus. The level of detail is also relatively decent on most animals. Again, the Gastonia I have to mention here, the close-up shots of it look absolutely brilliant with all the osteoderms and such. But my biggest criticism of the dinosaurs is kind of how boring they look. A lot of the dinosaurs are fairly bland in coloration, with a lot of bland sort of brown, black, green colours going on. There are one or two that do have some nice coloration to them, but overall a lot of them are quite bland in colour. And if I look back at the original show, you had the design of the Coelophysis from episode 1, you had the design of the Allosaurus from episode 2, and the Ornitholestes from episode 2, you had the design of the Liplorodon and the Rhamphorhynchus in episode 3. In episode 4 you had those beautiful coloured European iguanodons. In episode 5 you had the very complicated detail on the Lileniasaura. And in episode 6, well, you had that beautiful black and yellow Ankylosaurus. But in Walking with Dinosaurs 2025, there are not many designs that stand out. Again, probably the Gastonia, but that's still a bit bland. Maybe the Utahraptor from that same episode. But again, the Utahraptor is very simple in its design. The Lucititan, maybe in episode 6, is subtle in coloration, but overall, I think just far too many of these animals are just visually kind of boring. And moving on from their design is dinosaur behaviour. And this is one area that I think Walking with Dinosaurs 2025 solidly fails with. The issue of boring design has bled into this aspect, and so we have a lot of boring behaviour as well. The original program, Walking with Dinosaurs OG, became famous but also perhaps infamous for its imaginative take on the behaviour of these animals that in reality we can only really speculate about. So we had a lot of sort of theoretical speculative behaviour being shown, whether that's the Cynodonts in episode 1 mating for life, or in episode 2 all of the details around sauropod mating and sauropod babies, or episode 3 where you had everything to do with the aquatic animals, or episode 4 where you had this theoretical migration of Ornithocheirus. Walking with Dinosaurs 2025 rarely decides to go for such imaginative takes. The new program has a hyper focus on showing hunting behaviour more or less entirely through the show. Rarely do we see any unique or special behaviours. Episode 6 is the only episode that shows anything in relation to mating display behaviour, for example. Behaviour depictions are a rarity in the program, not the rule. Carnivores primarily just hunt. And it's only the Albertosaurus episode later on, I think is episode 5, that is really the only time we see carnivores doing anything but hunting, really. Some of the hunts are also just plainly stupid. They are entirely driven by the stupidity of the prey animal, which makes the hunts feel completely unrealistic and kind of stupid. There's one particular hunt in episode 2 with the Spinosaurus where a Carcharodontosaurus loudly, and it's quite distinctly loudly, walks right up behind an Azdarchid in the same way the T-Rex did in episode 1, and it's not an Azdarchid, it's a Hadrosaurid, and kills it, because the Hadrosaurid just stands there doing nothing, even when the Carcharodontosaurus loudly stomps up right behind it. It's just plainly stupid, and a lot of these dinosaurs seem to behave in stupid ways. It just doesn't really feel realistic. Related to this is that one of the biggest disappointments with the show is the worlds feel totally lifeless, or really lacking in life. In the original program, most episodes had a cast of about 5 animals. So if I was to pick an episode at random, let's go with episode 3, as it's my favourite. You had Criploclidus, Ophthalmosaurus, Liplorodon, Rhamphorhynchus, and Eustriptospondylus. Those were your big 5 animals, and then you had Hybodus sharks as a sort of recurring background animal, as well as ammonites. So really you had like 7 key animals. Or if you take episode 5, you had Lileniasaura, Muttaburrasaurus, the polar allosaur, which I believe is supposed to be Australovenator, Coolosuchus. That's 4 key animals. Not as many as episode 5, but you get more time with them. In the new programs, we're lucky to have 3 animals, and in fact the Edmontosaurus is repeated in 3 separate episodes as a creature, and a basic form of Asdarkid pterosaur in some way shows up in about 3 episodes as well. So the whole world feels like it's full of copy-paste animals and just seems very empty. Even in episodes where you have these mass migrating herds, the fact that they're all exactly the same size in the long shots just adds to this copy-paste nature, and there's just nothing else with them. The whole world just feels really empty, and I don't think it's a very good representation of the Mesozoic time period either, because we don't really get many other animals showing up. We don't have an aquatic episode. The only time an aquatic reptile shows up is a dead pliosaur in episode 6. And as I said, pterosaurs are limited to basically the same as Darkid that shows up. And it means that the show ends up feeling like it has an extraordinarily limited focus, and we get a very limited look at any of these locations. And related to that is that the show hyper focuses too much on the Cretaceous time period. 5 of the 6 episodes were focused solely on Cretaceous period animals. We only got a single Jurassic period episode, and this is an enormous disappointment when compared with the original program setup. In the original Walking with Dinosaurs, we got a grand narrative from the late Triassic period all the way through the Jurassic to the Cretaceous period. So we got to see the rise of the dinosaurs, the success of the dinosaurs, and the fall of the dinosaurs. In Walking with Dinosaurs 2025, we just have 5 Cretaceous period episodes, 3 of which copy-paste the same Edmontosaurus and the same as Darkid, and 1 Jurassic period episode. It just has a really unrepresentative look at the time period of the dinosaurs. Moving on to talk about our narrator, so he's fine. In fact, I've completely forgotten his name. Give me 1 second. Bertie Carvel. That's the name of the new narrator, Bertie Carvel. He's fine, but he's no Kenneth Branagh. Like, the fact he sounds so monotone and kind of bored, it's nowhere near as good as Kenneth Branagh. There is none of the grand nature that Branagh's original narration for the original show has, and there's very few moments of added emphasis or emotion. It just comes across as a kind of bored nature documentary, and it doesn't help the show feel more exciting, and that's not helped either by the show's unique style, for want of another term. If I was to point to something that I think is truly awful with Walking with Dinosaurs 2025 that I'm most critical of, it's the paleontology sections. They interfere with the narrative of the CGI dinosaur sections. They constantly cut into interesting moments or scenes. You'll be watching something between the dinosaurs that's really interesting, and you've been with them for like a couple of minutes, and then suddenly cut and you're back to the real world paleontologist digging up bones again. And it's just completely ruins any possibility of immersion or caring about the narrative of the dinosaur sections. And these paleontology sections are also really badly faked. They're clearly scripted because there's some really awkward conversations going on between these scientists. And I feel really sorry for them because, and I don't mean to be rude here in what I'm going to say, the show makes these paleontologists look kind of robotic because they're really awkward and they don't know how to talk to one another, it seems. The way that these paleontologists are interacting doesn't seem like they are not neurodivergent. I feel really sorry for them having to act in this way for the program because it just makes them look boring and it just makes them look bizarre. And these paleontology sections also misrepresent the science because a number of these fossils are very and quite clearly not fossils that are just being dug out of the ground, but that's how the show presents it. It presents these post-prepared glued back together fossils as things that are just coming out of the ground, or are clearly casts. Occasionally the show will admit that it's a cast, but it doesn't really ever tell you the truth about this paleontology stuff that's going on. And I think it just ends up misleading the audience, especially younger audiences, about how much work goes on in paleontology, not in some place in Montana where you're digging up a bone. That's like 1% of paleontology. The rest of it occurs in a lab. And the fact that the show just sort of makes it seem that like this person has just dug a bit in the ground and pulled out this perfect T-Rex tooth, where you can see where the whole thing has been glued back together. It's just misleading, and it doesn't represent the science of paleontology all that well. That being said, I will give the show props for showing some of the science of what's going on, some of the new technology being used by paleontology, such as 3D scans of brain cases and 3D printing them out so you can look at the brains, or the drones that use UV lasers to locate fossils on the surface. You know, showing at least some of the science is at least better than nothing, so I will give it points for showing some of the modern sciences going into the paleontology. I just don't think that they should have been in the episode cutting up the CG sections. Prehistoric Planet knew this, and it put the science of the episode at the end of the episode, which I think would have been perfectly fine for this program. I already did a bit of a calculation. So on average, every episode still has about the same length of time in CGI, about 25 minutes or so, as the original episodes. The original episodes were about 27 minutes long and they were entirely CGI. That was the CGI section. So if you moved all of the real life science bit to the end of the episode, you could just have sort of half an hour with the dinosaurs and 15 minutes or so with the paleontologists at the end. You would still have the same runtime for the episodes, but at least you wouldn't be interrupting the narrative or the CGI section of the dinosaurs for your human plot. I feel like it would have worked better. In terms of sound design, which is the other thing I want to talk about because I think it's really important in both the dinosaurs and the music. So let's start with the music. The original Walking with Dinosaurs became famous for its grand orchestral music themes, and I'm sure I don't have to mention most of them to you guys. I mean, I bet most of you can remember the music that plays when we first see the Ornithocheirus, or the music that plays when we see the Diplodocus for the first time, or the music that plays at the end of episode 6. Walking with Dinosaurs 2025 has no music that really stood out to me. Most of it is generic sounding noise, frankly, and episodes don't have their own unique music tracks like they did in the original. They just all pull from the same suite of basic music. In terms of sound design for the animals, also there's nothing very distinctive. Again, if I said to you the sound of the Coelophysis in Walking with Dinosaurs, or the sound of the Ornitholestes in Walking with Dinosaurs, or the calls of the Ornithocheirus, or the calls of the Muttaburrasaurus, I bet a lot of people who watched the original show can still remember what they sounded like. In Walking with Dinosaurs 2025, the only animal that really has a truly distinctive vocal soundtrack is the Spinosaurus. It has some very distinctive noises that it makes. The rest of the animals in this show just seem to use generic sounding roars and hisses and vocalizations that really don't give them any unique flavor. The Lucid Titan in episode 6 makes just sort of generic dinosaur sounds. There's nothing as unique as, say, the bassy deep calls of the Diplodocus from episode 2 of the original show, for example. And that again just doesn't help making the dinosaurs feel unique or very interesting, because they all just sound very generic. So with all that discussed, what's sort of my general thoughts about this show? It's not a bad documentary. I want to make it very clear. I know I've been quite critical of it throughout this review, but I don't think it's a terrible documentary. This is not another Dinosaur with Stephen Fry or Dinosaur Fight Club. This product has clearly been made with a lot more passion and a lot more interest and a greater desire to make a good product than Dinosaur with Stephen Fry. But it isn't a fantastic standout program either. Had this program been called anything else, we would see it as just an okay paleo documentary program, and we probably would have been less critical of it than we are now. The problem is that nostalgic title. They called it Walking with Dinosaurs. And the fact is, that brings a certain level of expectation to older members of the audience. That's both our fault, but also the fault of the cynical marketing team that decided to do that for the BBC. The original Walking with Dinosaurs was the most expensive wildlife documentary ever made for television, and it was also the first of its type. You know, loads of documentaries have since aped the style, but this was the first. This was the groundbreaking paleo documentary of the 20th century. And not only was it groundbreaking, it was also made with an enormous level of passion and attention to detail. Every aspect of it was so carefully crafted. The sounds of the dinosaurs, the sound of the music, the choice of the narrator, the way that the script was written, the narrative style of the episodes, the choice of the dinosaurs, the way that the dinosaurs were depicted, the behaviors that were depicted, the colorations, everything was carefully crafted to create the perfect paleo documentary experience for the time, and that tells when you watch the program. This program, by calling itself Walking with Dinosaurs, this program in 2025 has attached those expectations to itself, and it doesn't achieve anything near the level of superlative performance that the original program does. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's definitely not something I would have expected from a program calling itself Walking with Dinosaurs. The other thing that confuses me about this show is who is it aimed at? Because there is, and this has just reminded me of something I forgot to mention when I was talking about general points, and that is the childrenification of this program. Walking with Dinosaurs original was not scared to show Liplorodon tearing Ophthalmosaurus in half. It was not scared to show Utahraptor feasting on a dead Iguanodon. It was not scared to show Coelophysis pecking apart a dead Postosuchus. The natural world of Walking with Dinosaurs was depicted with the same naturalistic violence that you see in any real world wildlife documentary. Walking with Dinosaurs 2025 chooses to censor almost entirely every aspect of the violence shown in this program. Kills will be hidden behind placed logs, or the shots will cut away before we can witness the kill again in order to censor the violence, and you will very rarely see the depiction of blood in this program. There basically seems to be no blood apart from only when it's a light smattering on the snout of some carnivore. But the childrenification of the program goes a lot further than just the depiction of violence or lack thereof. Animals are also anthropomorphized to hell. One aspect of this is the fact that every single animal is named like it's a character in a children's TV show. You then have animals doing behaviors that, if they were to happen, would be rare, such as in episode 1, where two baby dinosaurs of completely different species are loving on each other like this is the Land Before Time. Or you have animals clearly doing very stupid behaviors that normal animals wouldn't do, like deliberately putting themselves in harm's way. These animals just don't feel like natural animals. They just feel like creatures in a kids show that have been placed in a specific situation. And the censoring of any sort of violence, it just makes the show feel like it's babifying everything. But the problem is, this show, which seems to be aimed at kids primarily, I don't think the kids will be interested in the paleontology parts of it. I read an article where someone doubted that, or I read an article from a paleontology website where they said, I don't think that the kids are going to be bored by the paleontology sections. I think a lot of them will find it interesting. And yet you go on any review site and you'll see the parents of kids quoting their kids like saying, oh, it's boring whenever the episode cuts away from the dinosaurs and cuts back to the paleontology bit. Now, obviously that might not necessarily be true, but it's mentioned in a lot of reviews that kids are switching off the minute the show leaves just the CGI dinosaurs. And for those of us who are paleontology fans, I don't think the show says or does anything that really makes us want to stick around either. You know, the behaviours we're seeing are kind of generic, and that we've seen them being done far better elsewhere. The paleontology sections, I suppose they're kind of interesting, but because the science is dulled down and simplified, it doesn't really appeal to those of us who take an interest in the subject, because a lot of the stuff, this is, you know, very basic paleontology stuff. So I don't know who this program is really for. You know, it seems like they tried to appeal to both kids and to adults, and they've created a program that doesn't really appeal to either. And I kind of think that's insulting. There's a quote I remember, and I cannot for the life of me find the quote now, and I can't remember who said it. I'm pretty sure it was from Reverend Audrey, he who wrote Thomas the Tank Engine. But basically the quote goes something like this, that children can understand complex things if you do it simply, so you shouldn't dumb down the facts, the truth of something for them, because they are capable of understanding a lot more than a lot of people give them credit for. And I feel like in some respects, Walking with Dinosaurs 2025, if it is aimed at kids, has gone down the route of dumbing it down for the children to a point where it becomes totally misrepresentative. And you can see that a lot with the paleontology. But anyway, that was a bit of a tangent about the sort of the childrification. I warned you things might get rambly. Back to sort of like going over my general thoughts. Like I say, this is not a bad documentary. It just isn't a very standout one. It's going to be one of these documentaries that kind of just gets forgotten about, because in my opinion, the original Walking with Dinosaurs is still a superior product. Yes, the original Walking with Dinosaurs might be dated in terms of its paleontological information, in terms of some of its CGI shots look very dated these days, but as an overall product, taking everything as a whole, as some of its parts, it's a superior product in so many ways to the new show. Fundamentally, Walking with Dinosaurs 2025, as I've been calling it, is not a second season of Walking with Dinosaurs. And personally, I don't think it even earns being called Walking with Dinosaurs in the first place. It's, like I say, just a very average, mediocre wildlife documentary that just doesn't really do anything good enough to stand out. When you look at the original show, or the absolute tour de force which was Prehistoric Planet, or even older programs like Prehistoric Park, this is just boring, which is potentially the worst thing that I could say about any paleo documentary, that even a die-hard dinosaur fan like me just thinks it's kind of naff. So, that was my overall view of the series. If you have watched all of the episodes, let me know what you think of the show as a whole down in the comments below, because I'm really interested to see what you guys thought, especially about the splitting style that it picked, and sort of the limited dinosaurs roster that it used, and that sort of thing. I'm curious to see what you guys think. So let me know down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe if you're new to the channel, and I will see you next time. Until then, stay safe and goodbye.